Thank you, everybody, for allowing me to stand here today. I'm really honored to have a 70-minute keynote. So I panicked when I saw it was 70 minutes. So I decided to write everything down. So I've simply written it all down, and I'm going to read it out loud for you. And I've rehearsed in front of the mirror at home, but some things might go wrong on the road. During the presentation, I will draw on some of the research I've done on open dialogue, but also some of my experiences as an open dialogue implementer, practitioner, and teacher. I will, as the title indicates, talk about power in collaborative dialogical approaches. But power in collaborative dialogical approaches is a complex topic to discuss because there are numerous ways of theorizing what power is. And you should think of this presentation as a series of highlights rather than a comprehensive overview. Also, sometimes I'll be talking about generic collaborative dialogical approaches, and other times I'll talk specifically about open dialogue approaches, and I'll do my best to try and keep this clear. I need to make sure that this works. It does. I've heard several people at this conference say that they, as part of their work, opened up dialogical spaces. And it's a central point for me today to point out that when we're doing this act of opening up dialogical spaces, we are using power. And whenever we use power, we need to consider if it's a just and legitimate use of power, and if we're helping the other or inadvertently causing harm now or in the future. We never have all the answers to these questions before we act, so we need to reflect on, very often, on our past actions and experiences and the consequences. And these questions are what my presentation will address in different ways. I'm very much aware that clinicians routinely reflect on these questions as part of their practice, but I hope to stimulate your thinking and your talking by introducing some topics and concepts that might be a little bit foreign to some of you. And the aim is to introduce these concepts to make the familiar a little less familiar and make some of these issues around power become something that we can talk more about and create a critical awareness about. Collaborative dialogical theory often emphasizes an ambition to promote egalitarian, non-hierarchical relationships between all participants in a session, which, for instance, is accomplished by taking a not-knowing stance and maintaining an openness towards what's going on in the therapy space. I believe this represents a fundamental tension regarding the notion of expertise in collaborative dialogical approaches. And the tension is about how to use the power of therapeutic expertise, an inherently privileged position, to bring forth voices in a therapy space in an egalitarian, non-hierarchical manner. I don't think that it's helpful to view this tension as indicative of flawed philosophy. I prefer seeing it as an ever-present invitation, maybe an obligation, to be aware of asymmetric relationships. And this may assist therapists in continually reinvigorating a necessary self-critical awareness. I, for instance, use it to continually ask myself, how dare you, Niels Boos, to pass judgment? How dare you, Niels Boos? And throughout this presentation, I will exemplify and problematize this tension with the aim of raising awareness about how to respond to it in ways that are likely to be helpful for participants. My interest in power and collaborative dialogical therapy started after collecting audio recordings for conversation analysis of network meetings at different sites in Denmark and Australia. At all the sites, meetings were referred to as open dialogue network meetings, and I will make no judgments as to whether a meeting adhered to or did not adhere to open dialogue fidelity criteria. This interest in text analysis and conversational analysis also means that I will talk about power in collaborative dialogical approaches with a strong emphasis on observable language use. And I'm aware that there are many more and important communicational aspects of healing meetings that I ignore by having this focus. I think that Danish sites are interesting to study because there have been strong systemic influences from Norway through the Tromsø team and dialogical influences from Finland through the Kiripudas team. And the emerging of these ideas have contributed to the creation of multiplicity of collaborative dialogical approaches in Denmark. And the Australian sites are also interesting because dialogical philosophies arrived relatively late compared to many other countries, and because many students from the first major cohort of trainees had traditional systemic family therapy training and roles before being tasked with understanding, translating, and implementing dialogical treatment philosophies. I guess what I'm saying is that it's interesting to study the genealogy of any collaborative dialogical practice, what made them possible in a particular context, and what gave them their particular characteristics. I've organized my presentation in 5 parts, and in between these parts there'll be time for a brief thought gathering between you guys. I'll be talking about interactional power, normative power, performative power, structural power, and micro-violence before reaching a close. And the first part of the presentation is concerned with interactional power, which is about someone's ability to influence, control, or shape social interactions in everyday communication and relationships. And I've written a fictional opening of a network meeting to show how opening a dialogical space is indeed an act of power. So please consider the following opening of a network meeting with the couple, Anne and Bob. The therapist, Theo, invites Anne to put into words what's important for her to talk about. Anne voices a concern about not being able to afford things that their kids need at school. Theo repeats some of Anne's words, and she responds by elaborating, "It's so embarrassing." After a relatively long pause, Theo asks Anne if he can continue by asking Bob to respond to what Anne has just said. Anne confirms that it's okay by responding sure, and Theo turns to Bob and the session continues. I would intuitively argue that the features of these interactions are collaborative dialogical. First, the opening inquiry starts with Theo checking in, and it gives the impression that Anne is free to nominate any of her concerns for the agenda. Second, the repeat of Anne's own words ensures that Anne is invited to talk about her own concerns and not Theo's. And although he nominates certain words and not others, what would have changed, for instance, if he had repeated what they need instead? We don't know. Third, by checking in again and politely asking for Anne's permission to turn to the next speaker, might give Anne a sense of agency and gives Bob a little time to think and prepare his response. The inquiry is designed as a circular question that does not nominate which parts of Anne's concerns Bob should talk about. Theo could have directed Bob to consider what he thinks about not being able to afford, or the kids' needs, or embarrassment. These inquiries would have been focused on specific parts of Anne's talk. In other words, Theo's contributions to the conversation are open-ended inquiries designed to gently explore Anne's own thoughts and words, and then inviting Bob to continue the exploration. Are things okay out there? I'm so concerned with my papers here. Yeah. Theo is using power to influence the interaction and relationships between the participants in this setting. He's a paternalist in the sense that he's full of good intentions about dialogue. If you do the dialogue, it's good for you. But the checking in and repeats makes his approach appear more like an influencer's nudging than that makes us make better decisions while still having some freedom of choice, but it happens within a guided system. So I would argue that a libertarian paternalism is what's taking place here rather than traditional weak paternalism that is usually used to describe therapy sessions. The conversational structure appears planned, but it's not. It's based on a particular attitude to the world and maybe a particular language use. And it would be naive to think of it in terms of a technique or something that could be manualized. And maybe something like this was what Anderson and Golician meant when they described the therapist as an architect of dialogue. At this point, I think it's important to consider authority, which is the legitimate right to exercise power in a given context. Someone's status, their position, is signaled or displayed in their stance, the way in which they show or enact their power. But status and stance are not always aligned. It's possible for people to upgrade or downgrade their stance relative to their status. In the example, there's an asymmetrical, I should say this, so I can't, in terms of my position, I cannot change that I'm male, I cannot change that I work at the university, it's a given. But what I can do is I can speak to people in a way that downgrades that authority. So my formal position is here, but I can downgrade it through my language use and the way I dress, my whole way of appearing. So in the example, there's an asymmetrical distribution of power because Theo is a therapist, and he's using his authority to control the opening of the meeting and inviting Anne to share her here and now concerns. However, by saying, I'm wondering rather than Anne, you're first, and checking in rather than simply turning to Bob, he's downgrading his position, he's downgrading his stance. So his exercise of interactional power is downgraded. And with a fancy word, this example of legitimate use of interactional power is called a deontic authority. And deontic in this context means to have the right or the duty to exercise power. There's another type of authority, which is the epistemic authority, which is about having legitimate knowledge in a certain situation. And as you know, everybody, epistemic is just a fancy word for knowledge. So it's about the knowledge authority. So someone's epistemic status, what we know they have, and like before, it can be displaced in different ways. So my epistemic status can be downgraded through my epistemic stance, the display of my knowledge, the display of my knowing. So formal therapeutic expertise is a classic example of epistemic authority, and the epistemic and deontic expertise is often interweaved. But here we need to separate it a little bit. Theo's authority is based on his position as a therapist and his knowledge about therapy. However, in the example, we're seeing that Theo's epistemic stance contains no signs of having any expert knowledge. Rather, through his inquiries, he's inviting and encouraging Anne to articulate her own knowledge about her situation, which legitimizes her personal insights and gives her epistemic authority in the situation. And it's important to know that the interactions do not delegitimize Theo's expert knowledge. And I guess if Anne had turned to him and said, I'm concerned about depression, what are the typical symptoms? If that had happened, Theo could have provided her with that information and thereby displayed his epistemic authority. Theo's approach is congruent with a collaborative dialogical approach, and it creates a complex situation where his deontic and epistemic authority to moderate the meetings is downgraded through the inviting and the polite language use. At the same time, the approach supports Anne's epistemic authority as it emphasizes the value and legitimacy of her personal value or knowledge. It might be helpful to consider what resistance looks like when considering interactional power in collaborative dialogical sessions. And please be aware that I know there's a lot of psychotherapists here today. It's not about resistance to the psychological process, it's social resistance to the events happening. So, in other words, what does non-collaborational, non-dialogical dialogue look like in these sessions? And one very powerful way of resisting is by not turning up to a planned session. Anne and Bob could have stayed away. They could also have walked out of a session. And another way we've observed resistance in these recordings is by being silent, which is really venomous to collaboration and dialogue. And it can stimulate some very interesting therapist responses. Consider, for instance, if Anne says nothing despite repeatedly being invited to contribute, and she's being nudged to contribute. And when she finally chips in, it might be with a small, I guess. The therapist will respond in some situations with excessive praise for her minimal participation, which is another powerful action that paradoxically might feel very uncomfortable for her. In many of these situations, we rarely know for certain if a participant's non-compliance is deliberate or not. If non-compliance should be interpreted as an act of resistance or as a simple failure to participate. So to sum up the first point, formal meetings between therapists and clients are never symmetrical, and power and resistance is present in all interactions. However, as demonstrated in this example, power is needed to create a transformative collaborative space and can be exercised, and this can be exercised respectfully and by means of gentle language use that minimizes displays of hierarchical differences. So downgraded stances may mitigate therapist authority, which may make participants ignore the hierarchical differences for a little while and allow for something different and new to happen. So this is the first thought gathering that you have exactly 3 minutes before I continue. Please turn to the people around you and I will start you again in 3 minutes. All right, everybody, please stop talking. Be quiet. Stop. Stop. We've got a tight schedule here. Stop talking. Thank you. The second part of this presentation is an invitation to think about normative power at play in structuring of collaborative dialogical network meetings. Norms influence behavior by setting expectations for what is considered acceptable or non-acceptable in a given context. They shape actions through the social pressure, rewards, and punishments. Often leading people to conform out of a desire for acceptance, legitimacy, or fear of consequences. And I wish to highlight that in time, interactional power can become normative power. With a metaphor, you can understand normative power as sedimented interactional power. Participants orient to a set of norms for how we do things here, which is not a power held by someone, but a set of conventionalized practices that participants follow. I think of these norms as unarticulated but powerful, an unarticulated but powerful agenda before the agenda. And the next slide includes a rough description of 3 different ways of structuring network meetings. These descriptions are based on comparisons of findings from analyses of the overall structural organization of interactions during the network meetings we observed in Australia, and in Denmark. I will talk about different levels of formality. In the most formal conversations, when and what people say is known in advance. That happens, for instance, in religious ceremonies or in court. Your turn to say, I do, when you get married, can only sit in one place, or you're not formally married. Informal conversations are the opposite. Turn takes and shifts between topics are spontaneous. And I'm sure that most of you have tried asking, how did we end up talking about this, when you've been out with friends drinking tea, coffee, or wine. So here, the more formal structuring of a network meeting sits to the left, and the more formal, which you can't see yet, will be sitting on the right. I've placed a structuring called rule-governed meetings, which were based on explicit interaction rules that were laid out to participants at the start of the meeting. You have to talk to the moderator, you can only talk to the moderator. For instance, interruptions and overlapping speech is forbidden, and interrupting transgressions were sanctioned with a shh, or to indicate and signal that stop what you're doing, it's against the rules here. The moderator would typically conduct mini-interviews with each participant, one at a time, and control the turn takes between the participants. I've spoken to you, and now I'm going to talk to you. Shifts between speakers stimulated circularity as they followed, as the following speaker would most often address the previous speaker's contributions. These rules would be repeated if a new participant came into a series of meetings. If it had been easy to fit into the slide, I would have called this the formal rule and therapist authority governed meetings or structuring, because the therapist will sanction transgressions by drawing on their deontic authority. On the right, I've got another distinct version of structuring, which is when moderators explained that the meetings were an opportunity for everyone to speak and be heard, but without explicating any rules for how this was going to take place. Moderators aimed to invite all participants to contribute at the beginning of the meeting and would rarely seek to control turn takes, with exceptions made if someone spoke excessively too much. Here, participants would often address each other, and shifts between topics were not formally decided on, but happened informally in the flow of interactions. And this is what I call the group-controlled meetings, because the moderators rarely drew on their authority to control interactions during the meeting. In the middle, there's a hybrid, which we have called the moderator-controlled meeting. Rules for interactions were never explicated by the moderators, but turn-taking was sanctioned by moderators through invitations to take turns in turn. Moderators preferred circular questions over one-on-one interviewing and exploration, and therefore the shifts between topics did not happen as formally as in the rule-governed structure on the left, but not as informal as the group-governed structure on the right. Here, moderators drew heavily on their authority and signaled to the other interlocutors that they governed the turn-taking, and that everyone would get a chance to contribute without having to interrupt. Also, in this middle version, we occasionally observed a level of playfulness in the structure, as people on their own initiative would copy moderator behaviors and become unauthorized moderators and signal that they understood and mastered the conversations. In the example with Anne and Bob, Anne might say, "Theo, is it okay if I ask Bob about what I just said?" So to sum up, these three different ways of structuring could be characterized as having different levels of formality, and I suggest that these different levels of formality are responsible for shifting participants' workloads and activating different modes of learning. Here I understand work in a very, very wide sense as any activity that takes an effort. Any activity that takes an effort being physical, emotional, or interactional. So consider the highly formalized structuring where participants are tasked with accepting the rules of interaction and adhering to them while the meeting is taking place. But after accepting the rules, participants can be more relaxed with regards to their participation in the conversation because the responsibility for taking turns sits squarely with the moderator. This creates a protection against interactional surprises and can assist participants in focusing on other work, for instance, emotional work. At the other end of the continuum, the informal structuring creates an uncertainty because someone might address a participant directly and bring them into the conversation. And conversations often resemble unhealthy conversations in outside life. This means that participants need to continually do both psychological and interactional work. In the moderator-governed structuring, participants cannot relax in the safety of explicit rules, but interactions are not as unpredictable as in the group-governed structuring because of the moderator's influencing engagement. In other words, a high level of formality reduces participants' interactional work, which allows participants to focus more exclusively on emotional work, whereas a high level of informality often requires participants to do both interactional and emotional work. To me, the different distributions of work means different opportunities for learning, which is the transfer of knowledge and skills from the network meeting to a setting outside of the network meeting into everyday life. And a good friend of mine, Anna Sidis, said that she had a network meeting with a young woman at the center of concern. The concern was psychosis, and she had invited her parents to the meeting. The meeting lasted 2.5 hours, and after the meeting, the family continued talking in their car in the parking lot for hours. The family was able to learn from the meeting and interact in a different way, which ultimately led to dissolving their problems, and the service never met this family again. I'm suggesting that the more rule-governed structuring might be harder for clients to establish dialogue outside the therapy space. Oh, did that make sense? I'm suggesting that the more rule-governed structuring might be harder for clients to use to establish dialogue outside the therapy space because the moderator is not there. And on the other hand, it might be challenging for participants to learn new skills without the moderator. So I'm not suggesting that one way of structuring is inherently better than another, but that structuring of meetings should be understood as a way of teaching participants on how to conform to social expectations of network meeting behavior, potentially with very different outcomes and transfer of learning. As before, it might be helpful to consider what resistance looks like when considering normative power. Consider a network meeting where one of the participants, it could be Bob, is slightly agitated about a concern, for instance, an experience of not being listened to by the system, and therefore continuing to talk about it. Bob ignores the implicit norms and explicit rules for participating in the meeting, and Theo responds by first allowing Bob to talk, and secondly starts to sanction the behavior, which does not help. And the behavior continues, and sanctioning is often escalated in an attempt to make all voices heard. Again, it's often impossible to know whether behavior is intentional resistance to the norms or unintentional violations of the norms. But as I say, norm-breaking behavior often activates authoritative responses from the therapists. Foucault famously spoke about various disciplining technologies. He regarded the ways in which people subjected to psychotherapy are encouraged to verbalize their emotions and past experience as a confessional technology of power. A key point here is that therapy is not just a healing process, but a mechanism of control where power and identities intersect. And most postmodern therapies have made good use of this Foucauldian point and used it to problematize hegemonic discourses that pathologize clients, and as a way of repositioning therapists as no longer as not knowing collaborators rather than the experts that can mediate the client's truths. I believe that it's helpful to also see collaborative dialogical approaches as technologies of the self, as we invite people into the conventionalized spaces of potential transformative dialogue. We're assisting them in internalizing dialogical practices and voluntarily adopting dialogue to regulate themselves. So please don't get me wrong here. I'm not suggesting that collaborative dialogical therapy spaces are bad. I believe that they're full of good intentions supported by humanistic philosophies, and they can be full of relating, play, of healing, of love. Bringing Foucault's point in here is simply a reminder that power always operates in these therapy spaces, and it shapes our subjectivities, and that needs continual self-reflection and scrutiny. Are we offering therapy practices with transparency and legitimacy? And again, you've got a thought gathering exactly 3 minutes, and then I'll call you back to the big group. All right, please stop talking. Stop talking. It's so weird to be at a dialogical conference and keep on repeating, stop talking. Stop talking. I'm going to talk about performative power now, because I want to talk about some of the power dynamics at play when dialogical approaches are implemented. I'm suggesting that the implementation of open dialogue approaches differ from the implementation of many other approaches because it often activates the voices of the suppressed. I wish to emphasize that research clearly indicates that user experiences of open dialogue approaches are very positive, both for the people at the center of concern and their relatives and social networks. Most participants describe the interactional structure that you saw before as something that felt odd at first, but then they became something that they could rely on and trust. And for many, listening to a reflecting team's talk about what they had heard and what had come to them as they listened to the conversations had been unsettling at first. But later these reflections had become small thought gatherings and a source of insight because it gave them a different perspective on what had been said. Most often these positive experiences were contrasted to participants' prior experiences of standard meetings in the mental health services and social services where they had often felt ignored or spoken at rather than with. There are reports of a small number of people who do not learn to appreciate the structure because of the emotional intensity or the workload. Participants at meetings must often take time off at work, which can be seen as increasing their practical work. And some insists on the promise of biomedicine that there's an effective cure, and they prefer the passivity of being patient. There are numerous examples of implementation initiatives that have met structural and organizational power and resistance in different forms. This may include inadequate billing structures, such as fee-for-service, that makes it impossible to fully implement a sustainable open dialogue approach that are often provided at a slow pace in people's homes by 2 staff members at the same time. When fee-for-service, and it's such an atrocity, is the only option for the financial management of a service, there are very few incentives for cross-boundary collaboration. Also, I do not have an issue with medical doctors, but I have an issue with their professional organizations that sometimes act more like guilds than unions. And in most of these implementation studies, if we're working in mental health services, nothing happens unless a consultant is on board with the project. Most organizational implementations of open dialogue are described as bottom-up initiatives with a very gradual implementation of selected elements of these approaches rather than a complete organizational transformation. As I continue, I'd like to start by asking you to consider these collaborative dialogical approaches as a speech act, as being performative. Originally, the idea of speech acts stems from Austin's book, How to Do Things with Words, where he makes the points that utterances, the things we say, have social effects. But the social effects are always dependent on the particular context. Take, for instance, the meaning of a stranger saying to you, "You're insane." How does the meaning change if you're informed that the person is a psychiatrist? And what happens if this psychiatrist says, "You're insane," when we're sitting in their office? It's a completely different meaning. Austin differentiates between three components of communication. First, there's locution, which is concerned with the literal meaning of an utterance. You're insane. Second, there's illocution, which is concerned with the intended meaning of an utterance. For instance, insulting someone by saying you're insane, or diagnosing someone by saying you're insane. And thirdly, there's perlocution, which is concerned with the social effects on the receiver of an utterance. For instance, responding to a diagnostic label that will trigger an institutional response, potentially with life-altering consequences. Shit, I think you should have seen this. Sorry. I will ruin this now. The idea I want to forward by bringing Austin into this is that what would happen if we start to think about collaborative dialogical approaches in terms of a speech act? I believe that open dialogue has been described and promoted with the illocutionary force of a promise. A promise that if you do this, you will improve the local mental health services. Consider, for instance, Daniel Mackler's beautiful film available on YouTube about open dialogue, where it says, and I quote, "Open Dialogue, a 74-minute documentary film on the Western Lapland Open Dialogue Project. The program presently getting the best results in the developed world for first break psychosis, approximately 85% full recovery, a far majority off antipsychotic medication." So my point is that these approaches are even more about, it's more than just improved health outcomes. It's also a philosophy that promises more egalitarian ways of collaborating in organizations and teams. This promise is an illocutionary effect, and I'll now turn to some reflections on the perlocutionary social effects of the promise of open dialogue on staff in organizations that are implementing open dialogue. I've worked with other models where the illocutionary force has been a command, do this, rather than a promise. Adhere to the theory and the protocol, and you're safe from critique because you're working evidence-based, something like that. As part of promoting the idea of open dialogue in the Australian context, we started, a small group of us, to offer extended introductions to collaborative dialogical practices to staff from social and healthcare services. A manager from an inner city refuge was very enthused after participating in one of these introductions, and suggested to establish an open dialogue clinic in the refuge to support social and family healing for some of their clients. The manager also made it possible for an employee at the refuge to participate in an extended course. The clinic was staffed by a combination of open dialogue trainees on a 3-year training course and staff from the refuge. Meetings began, and one of the first perceived barriers was that it took time and energy to organize the 4 meetings that were held every week. Booking a room and making sure that everyone turned up at the right time was a lot of extra work. But to some extent, we had expected this extra work. A few months later, staff reported another increase in their workload. They were used to putting out fires in clients' immediate situations. I've got this eviction note from my landlord. What should I do? Or I've slept in the streets for 3 days because I owe someone money and I can't go home. However, the network meetings made the clients think and act differently regarding their situation. And they began to ask for assistance regarding, for instance, education, job seeking, and changing to long-term housing. Staff were excited about these changes, but they felt burdened by them and started to ask questions about the role of the refuge. Who are we? And what services should we offer? Should we send people somewhere else as soon as they start to talk about education and long-term housing? The meetings also changed the relationships between staff members. The staff members participating in the network meetings gained confidence from participation in the meetings and became more prominent in the daily operations, while the manager expressed a sense of being sidelined and felt that it gave her problems managing the service. And this eventually made the manager take full control over the scheduling of network meetings and substituted the open dialogue enthused worker with someone with less training. So, considering the perlocationary effects, the formal organizational voices, most notably the managers, downgraded their stance for a while. Do you remember the status and the stance that you can downgrade it for a while? You can appear less authoritative than the authority you really hold. And that made the collaborative relationship within the organization appear changed. It appeared more democratic. However, a perceived need for clear governance structures, for hierarchy, made the manager intervene and shut down the destabilizing collaborative practices, which means that she suddenly upgraded her authority. Her stance was upgraded, and she became very authoritative because she needed the hierarchy in order to govern. So this is a very brief version of the very complex events taking place over an 18-month period. The point I wish to make is that if we view collaborative dialogical approaches as a speech act, it becomes clear that the approach also includes an illocationary force of a promise of a more egalitarian workplace. And that allows some voices that have previously not been heard to be heard, and that had huge organizational ramifications because the organization for a while accepted to be less authoritative, but in time it flipped back into the old hierarchical structure. And I think the enthused worker who left the service felt betrayed by the philosophy because she should have been allowed to have a more prominent voice, a voice that she had never had before in her workplace. So, there's a short thought gathering on your behalf. You've got 3 minutes. Please stop talking. Stop talking. Stop talking. Stop talking. Is this resistance or simple failure? Stop talking. Yeah, whose failure and whose authority? This is getting complex. The fourth part of this section is probably more concerned with open dialogue than with collaborative dialogical practices in general. And it's got to do with the ways in which the survivor and recovery movements have stimulated the merging of intentional peer support with open dialogue practices. We have several variations of peer-supported open dialogue, the pods. I'll talk a little bit about how structural power is embedded in the frameworks and institutions that organize the institutions that we wish to implement open dialogue in. This type of power is often subtle, and it can change our ways of working without our awareness. And there's a gazillion ways structural power operates, but I'll talk just about a single one. For a while, I've heard about a growing dissatisfaction with the notion of recovery. Critics, both amongst service users and service providers, have articulated a concern about the thievery of the content of the original radical concept describing a uniquely personal process, and instead substituting it with less radical content. For instance, the notion of clinical recovery has been criticized for simply being a new term for rehabilitation or for being in remission. Some people have even suggested finding a new term altogether to reclaim an edge over over-medicalized healthcare services. Therefore, I was not surprised when I came across a paper by Carl Cohen introducing the notion of neo-recovery. The prefix neo activated all my prejudice voices in one go. And I thought, here we go again. A predictable new term to rehabilitate the old notions of recovery. But as I started reading in detail, I became aware that neo was about neoliberalism, something that I had not anticipated. And neoliberalism is an economic and political ideology that emphasizes free markets, privatization, deregulation, and reduced government interventions in favor of individual competition and corporate interests. And Cohen's analysis gave voice to some concerns I've had for a while, but not been able to articulate very clearly. As I read the paper, Cohen makes two critical points from a collectivist position. First, there's been a relatively unacknowledged import of neoliberal values into present-day conceptions of recovery. He exemplifies this by analyzing Samsa's influential working definition of recovery and finds that the terms empowerment, self-direction, and responsibility are in line with neoliberal welfare reforms that downplays collectivism and community solidarity in favor of individualism. The second point is that social and cultural structure is missing in the current conceptions of recovery, which means that the crucial social determinants of health, such as race, gender, and social class, are pushed into the background. And Cohen's paper made me consider if there's such a thing as neo-dialogue. In the recent years, I've noticed a growing emphasis on empowerment. A growing emphasis on empowerment, on human rights, and on the responsibilization of families, and on individual voice in the open dialogue literature. And like Cohen, I am, from a collectivist position, concerned that the ways in which these concepts are appropriated by open dialogue scholars, they're not balanced sufficiently between individual autonomy and social responsibilities. In the same vein, I'm concerned that the open dialogue literature does not sufficiently consider socio-political contexts and social determinants of health. If you recall the opening example with Theo downgrading his stance and nudging Anne to talk more about her concerns about not being able to afford things for her family, for her children. Surely, who would not like to be met in this way? However, what if Anne has a working class background and is disadvantaged by intergenerational trauma and poverty? And Theo cannot avoid signaling his relative privilege and relative wealth through his way of speaking, his clothing, his demeanor. And my point is that it's possible to theorize significant meetings between human beings, but I believe that the social is already always present, always already present in the meetings, and that has a fundamental influence on what can happen in the meetings. And my hope is to inspire an increased awareness of how neoliberal discourses are changing the ways in which we perceive broader social structures and the responsibilities of the state. We started a little bit late, so I'm going to be just mindful of that. Decisions. Do you want to talk now, and I'll skip the 5th section? Okay. The group has voted. Pardon? I can't hear you. Never mind. The 5th point, the no thought gathering now, that's definitely out. The 5th point I want to make today is about microviolence, and it's related to the discrepancies between clinicians' good intentions and their actual practices. I want to talk about microviolence, which is often subtle, often normalized acts of harm that reinforce social hierarchies and inequalities. It happens all the time, and my favorite example, I guess, is when men speak first and most, much more than their fair share, even in these dialogical settings. In our research, I've observed overworked clinicians using the most beautiful collaborative dialogical language use, but insulting and shutting up families by getting basic details wrong about their situation. When therapists doze off, they get names wrong. And I believe that it's more correct to talk about microviolence than power in these situations. And the infamous Bakhtinian monologue is not the only way to be violent and to silence people. Like resistance, clinical actions can be interpreted as well-intended and well-executed. Sometimes they're well-intended but go wrong. And this is the part we're not good at talking about. Sometimes we're flawed, we're not very good at what we're doing, and they go wrong. And I want to share an example with you, which we have reported elsewhere in some detail, from an open dialogue session designed with a lengthy reflection by a reflecting team at the end of the session. Reflections are particularly precarious because of the structuring. Normal turn-taking is suspended as therapists ask clients to listen and not interrupt the reflecting team. Usually we have as speakers the option to correct others talking about us, but here, part of the transformative process, clients have no opportunity to object. And what you see here is a transcription of a small part of the reflection where we've got Mil, and I'll just talk about Annelies, her contribution here because of time. Annelies says, I just think it's vulnerable. It's vulnerable, really vulnerable, still, to like feel that my body is done, it's destroyed. I hear her say that. And the point here is that Annalise took notes during the meeting, and she quoted the client for saying, "My body is done, it is destroyed." And she's bringing it back into the conversation as a way of saying, "I heard you. Your body is destroyed. It's a huge problem, and I think it's vulnerable." And my point here is that it's taken out of context. When the client spoke about her body being destroyed, she was complaining about her GP not giving her strong medication to deal with her pain. And my point is that it's taken out of one conversational context and put into a different one, which completely changes the meaning of the original utterance. And we do not know if we're picking this up because we've got audio recordings, or if the client picked this up and thought, "Hey, I didn't say that in that context," and did the client have the opportunity to object in that situation? Or how should we think about these situations where there are these slight distortions of what has been said? And it comes back to your point from, I think, 2 days ago, Jaakko, when you said repeating is better than paraphrasing. The solid, perfect repeat is a safer way of going around things than paraphrasing, because it allows for distortions of what was originally said to come into the conversation. But we don't know how Gitte responded to this micro-violent, I would say, situation where her voice is twisted in a particular way that wasn't what she intended, and then it's being used against her to make a therapist point while she's being silent, but through the normative structuring. I have an ending, but I'd rather pass the word on to the two next speakers.